As in this channel, I feel that you watch every isekai anime that gets released. I decided to bring this season's isekai, which tries to give an Overlord kind of vibe, but does not come even close. However, that does not mean this anime is bad. It is still enjoyable to watch, especially for people who love to watch a cliché anime during lunch break. And the hero or villain of this story is named Iratakudo. He is a lonely, terminally ill patient, without friends, whose family only cares about the payment of his life insurance. That is why no one ever goes to visit him in the hospital room. His only comfort is the world of Eternal Nations, a civilization building RPG he plays all the time, since he has nothing better to do. One day, Takudo loses consciousness because of his illness, and when he opens his eyes again, he finds himself sitting on a stone throne in the middle of a forest. While asking himself what is going on, he sees a woman emerging from among the trees, calling him my king. That woman is Etta, Takudo's favorite character in the world of Eternal Nations. Even though he is excited to be able to see her in real life, he does not know exactly how to react. Fortunately, Atu herself is aware that she is part of a game, and she knows exactly who Takudo is. He being the legendary player who stayed at the top of the ranking year after year. She remembers every move she made alongside Takudo, and she knows him better than anyone else. And both are happy for finally meeting each other in person. Takudo asks Atu if she was the one who summoned him there, but in reality, Atu also has no idea what is happening. She simply appeared in the middle of that forest all of a sudden, but she is sure that place is not the afterlife. If she had to guess, she would say this world is similar to Eternal Nations, but there is still no way to be certain. Either way, Atu thinks this is a great opportunity and asks Takudo if he would like to restart at her side, rebuilding a new kingdom. Just like in the good old days, Takudo likes the idea and agrees to work together with her. Although now it is a little embarrassing to be personally side by side with each other. Their first task is to find out where they are. Takudo uses his magic to summon a scout, but seeing it up close, he feels disgusted by the ugly appearance of the creature, yet there is nothing he can do about it. After all, his civilization called Minagra is known for ruling over darkness and evil. His initial strategy is to avoid drawing too much attention in order not to enter conflicts before they are strong enough to defend themselves. And that is where the insect scout comes into play. Takudo orders it to search the area and inform him about anything important. At first, the insect just stands still staring at him, but Atu firmly reminds it that Takudo is its commander. The insect then rushes off to fulfill its mission. Takudo feels relieved, realizing that he can still control his troops in this world, in the same way he did in the game. He is also able to partially see what the insect sees, and that should help him figure out where they are. Thinking about the next steps, Takudo reflects on his 200 initial mana points, but he has already spent 100 points to summon the scout, and now the rest is only 100 points. He plans to build a settlement that will serve as an operations base, which will cost 20 mana points. After that, not much mana will remain to work with. He even wanted to create a warrior to protect him in case they were attacked, but that is still not viable. Atu assures Takudo that he does not need to worry because she will fight for him. However, that does not sound very reassuring, since at the moment she only has the strength of an ordinary person, and as part of the heroic unit, Atu will become stronger over time. But for now, there is little she can do. The insect continues moving quickly through the forest, and thanks to its scouting, Takudo begins to understand the terrain better. He is surprised to notice that although the whole area is a forest, he has not seen any animal or monster. Atu assumes that all animals are hiding, since the forest offers many places for camouflage, but Takudo's main concern is that if he does not find some animals soon, they will probably have to spend the little mana they have to obtain food. Atu apologizes to Takudo as she feels bad for not being of much help, but he tells her not to worry, since simply having her by his side is a great moral encouragement. Hearing this makes Atu very happy, and she tells Takudo that she is very grateful for his kind words. However, Takudo is still having difficulties getting used to how expressive she is now that she is a real person. At that moment, the scout finds something interesting. It calls Takudo's attention and shows him a settlement of dark elves in the middle of the forest. They are very far from Takudo's current location, and it seems that many elves are gathered there. Atu feels relieved to notice that they are only dark elves, since they tend to lean toward neutral evil which means they will not necessarily be hostile to the kingdom of Minagra. However, Takuto still thinks this is a major problem, because there is the possibility that no other civilization is close to his. His plan was to avoid war by staying hidden for as long as possible, but that will not be viable with the Dark Elves so near. Atu suggests that the two abandon this place and move to a new location, and Takuto agrees since they have not built anything yet. But before that, he wants to observe the elves a bit more and explore this area to see if there is anything useful nearby. Suddenly, Atu feels the presence of someone close, and then she and Takuto turn around and see a group of dark elves emerging from the forest. The elves look just as surprised as they are, because they had no idea there were other people in this forest. In fact, the dark elves only came here because they were expelled from their homeland. With nowhere to go, they were forced to enter this cursed forest. The journey takes a heavy toll on the elf children, and at this pace, they will not survive much longer. A small group was sent to search for a food source, and the leader of the group is certain that there must be something edible around here, since there is so much vegetation. But Amy is very nervous. She has heard rumors about a dangerous forest on the border, where an ancient evil was sealed, and she fears that they might be attacked. But their leader assures her that such rumors are nothing more than superstition, for if there really were an ancient evil lurking in this forest, the trees here would not grow so well. Although he cannot deny that the forest truly makes him uneasy for some reason. And this is how the elf named Gia sets his eyes on Takuto, his heart sinking in despair, because what he sees before him is a manifestation of pure evil. He wants to run away, but he fears that any rash action could place himself and his people in danger. So he slowly approaches Takuto's throne and kneels before him as a sign of respect. He introduces himself as the chief warrior of the Elven clan and apologizes for entering the forest without Takuto's permission. Atu has no idea why the elves are acting with so much respect, but decides to go along with it and demands to know why the elves invaded Takuto's lands. Gia begins to explain that his people lived in the Central Plains and they were a peaceful tribe. However, Atu is not interested in listening to the entire story, so she orders Gia to go straight to the point. He apologizes and quickly explains that his clan was persecuted and expelled from their lands, being forced to flee into this forest. He does not understand why his people had to suffer such cruel treatment, since they never did anything wrong. They always sought peace, but were attacked and killed because of prejudice against their race. Takuto casts a look over Gia and notices that the elf is very thin. The elf explains that he and his people barely managed to escape while their village was being destroyed. They had no time to gather supplies, and since they have been fleeing non-stop for days, they had no opportunity to look for food. In fact, that is the reason why Gia and his team went out on their own, and it has already been 5 days since any of them last ate, and they still have had no luck finding edible plants or animals. Takuto feels pity for them and decides to help them a little. He uses part of his mana to create some apples, and Gia is surprised to see the apples rolling on the ground, for he had never seen anything like it. He hesitates to taste them, afraid of being disrespectful before a being like Takuto, but the others are starving and do not care. They all bite into the apples, and this turns out to be the best thing they have tasted in a very long time. Takuto also creates some pears so that the group has enough to eat, but Gia remains in shock at his kindness and does not know how to react. Atu yells at him, saying it is rude not to accept the kindness that Takuto offered so generously. He then presses his head against the ground and says that he deeply appreciates Takuto's generosity. However, there are children in the camp who are much weaker from the lack of food and will die soon if they do not receive something to eat. So Gia asks permission to take this food back to his clan and feed those children. Takuto feels pity for the children who are suffering and decides to go further, creating a large amount of different foods for Gia to carry with him. Although Atu does not approve, since doing something like that costs him a great amount of mana. The elves are completely incredulous to see so much food and become even more shocked when Takuto says they can keep it all. For years, the elves were oppressed and forced to live in the shadows, so no one had ever extended a hand to them in such a way before. They express their deepest gratitude to Takuto and carry the food back to the camp. At the camp, all the elves are already on the verge of giving up, but some still keep hope that Gia and the others will return with some food. At that moment, everyone in the village smells a delicious scent in the air, so they turn to look, and to their joy they see Gia and the others carrying bags of food on their backs. Everyone is relieved that they no longer need to starve and begin praising Gia for finding so much food, but when asked where he got it, he only says that he was lucky, omitting the details of his encounter with Takuto. Later that night, Gia is staring into the fire, lost in thought, when suddenly he is approached by the clan leader named Mauter. He tells the chief warrior that he did a great job that day and that the fruits he found are incredible, but he notices that Gia does not seem very happy about it, so he asks what is wrong. After a brief silence, Gia explains that he encountered a legendary entity deep in the forest and does not know how to feel about it. Mauter asks what legend he is talking about, and Ino mentions something about a powerful being that was sealed in the cursed forest. Mauter had already heard of that legend before and is shocked to learn that Gia actually encountered the King of Ruin. He explains that according to the legend, when the world becomes too prosperous, the King of Ruin descends upon the earth to destroy everything, forcing all civilizations to start again from zero. To be honest, Mauter cannot guarantee that the legend is true, but he is inclined to believe it. He asks Gia if the being he encountered introduced himself as the King of Ruin, but Gia does not recall him saying anything like that. However, given the terrifying appearance he had, a title like King of Ruin would certainly fit him. Mauter then asks Gia if he spoke directly with the King of Ruin, but Gia replies that it was not exactly a conversation. The King of Ruin did not speak much during the encounter, but there was a woman at his side who spoke on his behalf, and from the way he described the situation, Mauter is absolutely certain that this entity is a sign of bad news. He then asks Gia if, to receive that food, he had to do something such as selling his soul in exchange. Gia explains that the King of Ruin asked for absolutely nothing in return. Even so, Mauter finds this absurd, because what kind of evil being gives something away for free? Gia also does not know exactly why he did it, but if he had to guess, he would say it was out of mercy. He believes the King of Ruin must have felt pity for the situation of their clan and ended up offering his help to save them. Mauter is shocked to hear Gia referring to the King of Ruin as His Grace, since that is a title reserved only to demonstrate a high level of respect. But Gia sees no problem with it, because he believes that Takuto truly is someone worthy of respect. Mauter cannot believe that Gia is defending the King of Ruin and even asks if he might have been hypnotized or something like that. But Gia rebuts, saying that the only reason they can afford the luxury of arguing is precisely because of the food they received from this so-called evil god. And at that moment, it is not as if he could simply refuse the offer, since everyone was on the brink of starvation. So what exactly did Mauter want him to say? Mauter realizes he has no right to judge Gia's decision to trust the King of Ruin, but given the circumstances, indeed this was the best option available. However, as an elder of the tribe, he considers it his duty to ensure everyone's safety. Therefore, he declares that from now on, he will be the one responsible for conducting the negotiations with the King of Ruin, because with more than 200 years of life, he believes he will be able to reach an understanding with such a being. Meanwhile, back at Takuto's camp, he is being scolded by Atu for having recklessly wasted mana with real Addis. She asks why he would do something like that, but Takuto says that he felt pity for the elves and did not want to let the children go hungry. Atu says that she understands, but reminds Takuto that they have barely begun to establish themselves in the kingdom and that they cannot go wasting resources like that. She is absolutely right, and Takuto apologizes for not consulting her before using his mana. He promises to make it up to her, but leaving that aside, there is something that bothers him. He was unable to properly speak with the elves when they appeared, because he was extremely nervous. Atu is surprised to hear this, since she believed Takuto had been deliberately acting the role of a sovereign, but in truth, he is simply socially awkward. At that moment, the scouting insect returns and informs Takuto that the elves are once again approaching the area. Takuto and Atu are surprised at their return. Takuto remembers that he had given them far too much food, more than they were able to carry the last time, so he assumes they are coming back to fetch the rest. Having different cultures living close together will inevitably cause some sort of conflict at some point, and that is precisely why Takuto truly wishes the elves would just take the food and leave at once. He could simply order them to leave the forest, but that would require maintaining a conversation with someone other than Edu, and that is already far beyond Takuto's social abilities. Atu notices that Takuto is uncomfortable with the situation and comes up with an idea. She suggests that she herself take over all negotiations in his place. That way, Takuto would give off the impression of a mysterious and dignified king, rather than a socially awkward teenager. He likes the idea, but asks if it is really all right to let her do all the work of speaking for him. Atu promptly replies that she is always happy to help, and that there is no problem at all in being Takuto's voice. Shortly afterward, Mauder and Gia arrive at Uelian before Takuto. First, Mauder introduces himself as the chief of the elf tribe and expresses his deepest gratitude to Takuto for having provided the food his people so desperately needed. He then asks to know the name of their benefactor so that he may properly thank him. After a brief pause to confirm with Takuto, Atu announces that they are in the presence of the King of Ruin, called Era Takuto. Gia is left speechless upon realizing that Takuto is indeed the legendary King of Ruin, but he knows he cannot afford to be rude. So Mauder once again thanks Takuto for his generosity toward them. Takuto feels relieved to see that the negotiations have gone smoothly so far, and since there is no conflict with the elves, he simply tells them to take the food and leave quickly. Both Gia and Mauder are shocked to hear this, for they had been fully prepared to pay a high price in exchange for the help received from the King of Ruin. They ask Atu if it is truly all right for them to depart without offering anything in return, but she reminds them that in truth they have nothing of value to offer. Mauder, however, does not like the idea of leaving a debt unpaid, especially with someone as grand as the King of Ruin, for he fears that in the future it might cost them even their very souls, though he does not dare to say this aloud. Takuto notices that the atmosphere suddenly became tense, so he calls Atu aside to speak in private. Atu is truly irritated with Mauder's stubbornness and is convinced that if they leave the elves on their own, they will end up causing problems for them in the future. So Atu directly and coldly suggests that they simply kill all the elves and move on. However, Takuto was in fact hoping to build a mutually beneficial relationship with them. He realized that Mauder was uncomfortable with simply receiving help for free, especially from someone known as the King of Ruin, and therefore suggested that they demand a reasonable compensation to ease the elven leader's unease. Atu thought it was a good idea and conveyed Takuto's decision to the elves. Mauder seemed relieved, but Atu was still thinking about what exactly to ask for as compensation. She then turned to Takuto for guidance, and he told her to ask for information about the outside world. Following his instruction, Atu told Mauder that as payment he should provide Takuto with everything he knew about the lands beyond that forest. Mauder replied that he would be more than happy to fulfill this request. However, Atu added that once he finished providing the information, he and his people must leave the forest immediately. This demand made Mauder hesitate, for it would mean that the elves would once again be forced to wander the world without a home. He asked Takuto for permission for them to remain in the forest, but Atu swiftly denied this proposal, saying that if he valued his life, then it would be better not to reveal Takuto's presence to anyone. Gia was about to protest, explaining that the clan of elves would not survive if they were expelled from there, but Mauder interrupted him, realizing that they could not risk angering the King of Ruin. Thus, the two stood up and began to walk away, and as they watched the elves withdraw, Takuto wondered to himself if this was truly the right thing, since he did not want to force the elves to suffer further. It was then that he had a brilliant idea. He called the two back and asked if they would like to become his citizens. The proposal was so unexpected that the two were left speechless, unable to give an immediate answer. Even Atu was incredulous at what Takuto had just said. She then requested another private conversation and asked why he would make such an offer. Takuto explained that he was thinking of recruiting the elves through the refugee system. Upon hearing this, Atu acknowledged that, looking at it carefully, it was not a bad option. The elves were not inherently good nor evil, so they would not be in great conflict with Takuto's evil-aligned kingdom. Furthermore, in the game, the main citizens of Managra were homunculi, and frankly, Takuto did not want to spend the rest of his life surrounded only by such creatures. Takuto asked Atu if she truly wanted to live in a kingdom where only beings like that existed, referring to the homunculi and other unpleasant creatures. This convinced Atu, and she supported the idea. So she called the two elves and told them that if they accepted becoming citizens of Managra, they would be under the protection of the King of Ruin. Mauder asked what that would mean for them, and without hesitation, Atu answered that from the moment the elves joined Managra, they would officially be considered evil. She made it clear that the decision to join or not was entirely theirs, but assured them that if they accepted, at the very least, they would be able to live a more interesting life. Some time later, Takuto and Atu walked to the elves' camp, for they had finally reached a decision. Atu was a little irritated at how long it had taken them to agree, while Takuto, on the other hand, had already expected it would take some time, especially after Atu had told them that they would become evil. When they arrived at the camp, Mauder announced to everyone that their new king had come. Immediately, all of them knelt and made way for Takuto to advance toward the makeshift throne they had prepared for him. Some of the elves were terrified upon seeing him for the first time, while others looked excited. However, those who came too close ended up fainting from the immense dark energy emanating from him. Gia warned everyone not to look directly at Takuto, as it could be interpreted as disrespect, but Takuto did not mind. As soon as he sat on the throne and all the elves were gathered, he officially declared that everyone present would become citizens of Managra from that day forward, and that was basically it. Now all the elves were officially Takuto's subjects. However, Gia had expected something more elaborate, since Atu had said they would become evil. But at that moment, an immense wave of hatred began flowing into Gia's body, as he recalled all the injustices he and his people had suffered. The same happened to all the other members of the elf clan. They all remembered the persecutions they had faced, and they felt relieved and even excited to have someone like Takuto watching over them. A few days passed in the newly founded kingdom of Managra, but things were not going well at all for Takuto. He was examining the map Mauder had given him and became extremely frustrated. It was by far the worst starting location he had ever received. Atu asked what was wrong, and he pointed to the map, explaining that to the north of that forest lay the holy kingdom of Kalha, which worshipped the god Arlis, and also the elven kingdom of Anna, which revered nature. Both were strongly aligned with good, and if either of them discovered the presence of the evil nation of Managra, both Takuto and Atu would be doomed. There was absolutely no chance they could ever defeat such powerful nations. And to make matters worse, that cursed forest did not contain a single usable resource. The difficulty of their situation was simply unfair. On the other hand, there was at least one positive point. Now they could count on the elves, which meant they could compensate for some of the kingdom's weaknesses. And speaking of them, Atu noticed a group approaching, and she was pleased at the possibility that they might be bringing valuable information. Soon after, Mauder and Gia arrived, this time accompanied by Emil. Gia explained that Emil was very intelligent and possessed vast knowledge of traditions, legends, and international affairs. For that reason, he was certain she could be of great help to all of Takuto's plans. Takuto was pleased with this reinforcement, though he also noticed that everyone was still quite nervous around him. So he asked Atu to tell everyone that they did not need to act so formal. Moving on, Atu announced that Takuto had made some important decisions regarding the administration of Managra. From that day forward, Mauder and Gia would be appointed to key positions in the kingdom. Mauder would be responsible for managing administrative affairs, and from what Atu had heard, he should also be capable of using magic, which was one of the reasons she had high expectations for him. Gia, on the other hand, would be appointed as war captain of Managra's entire army, with full authority over all the troops. Gia felt greatly honored and promised to massacre anyone who dared to stand in Takuto's way without hesitation. Takuto, however, was a little uncomfortable with Gia's serious look when saying that, and he asked Atu to tell everyone that he preferred to maintain peace, as conflicts should only be initiated if absolutely necessary. Gia was incredulous at the fact that the King of Ruin was, in practice, a pacifist, but he did not insist on the matter. Atu then told everyone to rest for now, since soon they would begin building houses in the forest. Mauder thanked them for their consideration, and tried to stand out by saying that the knowledge he possessed would make him far more useful than the brute, and by brute, he was referring to Gia. However, Gia retorted, claiming that an old Mauder would not be much help in construction anyway. Atu was not particularly interested in their bickering, but she noticed that both were eager to get started, so she asked Takuto if she could order the immediate start of construction. Takuto saw no problem with it and authorized it, but made it clear that he wanted the materials to be gathered without destroying the forest. Atu thought the idea was excellent and asked Mauder if that would be possible. He replied yes, especially if most of the houses were made using the giant Zuka trees. Takuto liked the solution and told them to begin as soon as possible, reminding them to reforest as they progressed. The three prepared to begin but were left confused, as they did not quite understand what Takuto meant by reforest. forest. This surprised Takuto, since as far as he knew, the people of that world should already have unlocked fortified magic technology. Atu then asked if at least they knew military-level magic, or the 6 great elements. But Mauder said he had only ever heard of 4 great elements. And as for military magic, Emil doubted that anyone from other nations had knowledge of it either. Thus, Takuto and Atu realized that the people of this world were surprisingly underdeveloped. The elves' magical technology was far below what Takuto had imagined. However, if the rest of the world was at a similar level of development, Takuto believed he could catch up with them soon, though that would be something for the distant future. For now, Amo decided to explain what reforestation meant. Basically, it was the process of replanting trees as others were cut down, so that the forest would remain healthy. Normally, trees would take decades to grow naturally, but in this case, the term reforestation referred to a special technique that used magical elements to accelerate growth. She asserted that this was a technique personally created by Takuto, which was a complete lie, since he had not invented anything. But it would have been extremely embarrassing to tell the truth at that moment. Emil became excited at the thought of Takuto possessing such impressive knowledge. She asked if he was also responsible for creating the apples and grapes he had given them. She even commented that she had planted some grape seeds, and they had already begun to sprout. She could hardly wait to see how they would grow. At that very moment, Takuto and Atu fell silent upon hearing that Emil had planted a grape seed, for the thought had not even crossed their minds. Fruits like grapes and apples simply did not exist in that world, or at least had not until now. Takuto had managed to create them using his emergency production skill, and if his hypothesis was correct, that ability was not limited to creating only food. To test it, he summoned a coin, and as he expected, the experiment worked perfectly. Thus, with this new discovery, as long as he had enough mana, Takuto could create practically anything from gunpowder to basic metals and even petroleum. With that, conquering the world might not be as difficult as he had once imagined. Meanwhile, the Holy Empire detected signs of a dark presence in the forest. Because of this, Saint Selena, accompanied by a bishop and several knights, was sent to investigate. Meanwhile, in Managra, all the elves had been working hard on construction, and they finally completed the throne room. Takuto was extremely satisfied, since he would no longer need to sleep in the open, and his kingdom had taken another step toward world domination. At that moment, Takuto's administrators appeared, as a meeting on internal affairs of the kingdom was scheduled for today. They brought news to Takuto. They had finished the design of the new set of clothes he had requested. This made Takuto even happier, as he was tired of constantly wearing his pajamas. Atu and the others were glad to see that Takuto liked the new clothes so much, but they reminded him that urgent matters had to be discussed, so it was time to begin the meeting. However, Takuto seemed a little distracted, admiring his new look, so Atu suggested that they begin without him. The first to speak was Mauder, who asked Atu if construction should start in earnest, since aside from the throne room, practically nothing else had been built. Preparatory work had already begun. They had leveled the ground, trimmed nearby branches, but no substantial building had started yet. Atu replied that they should begin with establishing food production, as keeping the people well fed was the absolute priority. Mauder asked why they should worry about that, since Takuto could create food with his power. But Atu warned them they could not continue relying on Takuto to produce food, because if one day he were no longer present, what would everyone do? Mauder admitted she was right, so Atu stated that they needed to start immediately. Right after, she pulled a strange object from her pocket. Mauder was horrified at what he saw and asked what it was. Atu explained that it was a meat tree, which didn't sound good at all. This was a special type of tree that produced mysterious meat with a taste identical to human flesh. Atu declared that this would be the first stage of the food production plan. However, Mauder, Oja, and Emil all agreed that most people would not want to eat something that tasted like human flesh. But Atu promised that in the future they would have other sources of food, though for now they would need a place to store the meat from this tree. Emil volunteered to work on building a storage facility for it. As if things weren't strange enough, the meat tree could also talk for some reason. The next item on the agenda was research, since this would be essential for acquiring the most important technologies to advance rapidly. Mauder asked Atu what kind of technology they should prioritize in their research, and she replied that the priority should be magical technology, specifically military magic. Ordinary magic allowed a person to attack perhaps a dozen enemies at once, something Mauder was already capable of, but military magic was on another level. It allowed one to attack thousands of enemies simultaneously and even alter the terrain itself to create strategic advantages. Mauder was impressed to learn that such magic existed and expressed great enthusiasm to learn everything about it. He declared that he would personally take charge of the research. Finally, it was time to discuss military planning, and Gia immediately volunteered to begin mobilizing an army. But Takuto interrupted, saying that in fact, they did not want to invest much effort in that for now. He explained that armies produced nothing, they only consumed resources, and at the moment, Minagra did not have enough resources to sustain armed forces. Moreover, even if they did have an army right now, they were nowhere near strong enough to defeat any nation, so it would be pointless. Gia protested, arguing that with things as they were, they would have no way to protect Takuto if they were attacked. To make matters worse, both Mauder and himself had bounties placed on their heads for being leaders of the Dark Elf clan, meaning they could be hunted down at any moment. Given the situation, Takuto agreed that completely neglecting defense would be a bad idea. However, he still didn't want to pour all their resources into forming an army, so instead, he decided to create a hero. Atu approved immediately, explaining that despite the high cost of producing a hero, it was far easier to sustain one powerful individual than an entire army. Mauder and Gia were confused and asked Atu to clarify what she meant by a hero. She explained that there were several heroes in Minagra who served directly under everyone. Each one was extremely powerful and possessed unique special abilities, but they also tended to be somewhat eccentric, which could make living with them irritating at times. There were various conditions that needed to be met to summon a hero, but considering their current progress, it should soon be possible. As a bonus, summoning a hero would not attract nearly as much attention as creating an entire army, allowing Minagra to remain hidden. With that, all concerns regarding internal affairs were momentarily resolved. In secret, the happiness of Minagra's citizens was extremely important, since the more unhappy they were, the more mana Takuto would be able to generate. Meanwhile, in the Empire, the young paladin Lornias was praying in the cathedral. When the veteran paladin Erdal approached to talk, Lornias asked him to lower his voice, as it was a sacred place. But Erdal insisted, saying he only wanted a friendly chat. After all, they had both been assigned to the same investigation, and it was nearly time for them to depart. As Lornias stood up, he was observed by Wendell, who noticed a wedding ring on his hand and remarked that he must have a family waiting for him. Erdal asked about his wife and daughter, and Lornias revealed that his wife's name was Marcia and his daughter's name was Mina, but he stated that his personal life was irrelevant to the mission, and he did not intend to talk much about it. Erdal began complaining about them being assigned to such a useless mission, but Lornias reminded him that it was based on a revelation from Saint Selena, and therefore must be taken seriously. Even so, Erdal found it strange that the team was so limited. They were only 2 paladins, while the rest of the group was made up of mercenaries hired to fill the gaps. Nothing about this mission seemed good, especially because it involved exploring the southern forest, so Erdal only wanted to finish it quickly and return home. Meanwhile, back in Minagra, construction was going very well. The place was finally starting to look like a true civilization, and the Dark Elves no longer seemed bothered by the meat trees. Takuto was excited, because seeing all of it in person was a completely different experience compared to when he played in the virtual world. Emil guided him on a short tour, showing him the residential area, which was mostly made up of houses built in the treetops. She explained that since they had been focusing on food production, Minagra hadn't had much time to work on housing, but the meat trees were growing well, and the food storage facility should be completed soon. Meanwhile, Mauder was working on his massed research at the Institute of Magic he had established, with the participation of several citizens talented in the arcane arts. In addition, they had discovered a nearby spring, ensuring a supply of drinking water. Finally, Emil showed him the building designated as the public office, where Minagra's administrative meetings would be held. Emil commented that she wished she had built a slightly more sophisticated structure, but with their current resources, that was the best possible result. Takuto was satisfied with the initiative Emil had been showing, since she was handling her responsibilities very well. He was also glad to see that the Dark Elves, who had been on the verge of death when they first met, were now full of vitality. Still, Emil grew nervous. She couldn't read what Takuto was thinking, so she asked if he was satisfied with her work so far. Takuto replied that she had done an excellent job and said he was very happy to have her as a citizen of Managra. For Emil, receiving such high praise from him was the greatest possible gift, so much so that she even shed tears of joy. After composing herself, Emil led Takuto to the meat tree farm. Progress was going well thanks to all the agricultural equipment he had provided. However, Emil still felt uneasy about those strange, talking trees, so she changed the subject and showed him the water spring she had found. As Takuto accompanied her into the forest, he noticed that, for some reason, the scenery looked different from before. When they arrived at the spring, Emil was horrified to see that the water had turned completely murky. Mauder and Gia soon appeared, having heard that Emil wanted to build an aqueduct from the spring, but now, with the water in that state, they believed it could no longer be used. However, when hope began to fade, Atu declared that the water was still perfectly safe. To prove it, she crouched down and took a sip, shocking everyone with the risk of death she had just taken. But she urged them to take a deep breath, and when they did, they noticed strangely that the air seemed even better than normal. Atu explained that this was one of the advantages of Managra being an evil nation. All the land near the kingdom had become cursed terrain, which granted bonuses to evil-aligned creatures and penalties to neutral or good ones. Thus, even though the water, air, and soil appeared dark and deadly, Managra's evil citizens suffered no negative effects. There was, however, a small problem. A cursed forest was very conspicuous and undermined their strategy of remaining hidden. As long as the cursed area remained small, there wouldn't be much risk, but as Managra expanded, it would become easier for enemies to discover its location. Because of this, Gia and Mauder suggested beginning work on forming an army. Ada, however, said it wasn't necessary, since a single hero was more than enough to handle any initial threat. Since Mauder and Gia still didn't fully grasp what a hero was capable of, Atu decided to demonstrate. Tentacles sprouted from her back, and in an instant, she cut down all the surrounding trees. The two were left in disbelief at what they had just witnessed, and Atu revealed that she herself was also a hero. She said that ever since arriving in this world, her strength had been gradually returning. Although she was still far from her peak power, the point was that heroes were incredibly strong and only grew stronger over time. So, as long as they didn't face a serious threat, Takuto believed they were safe. Even so, he was a little annoyed with Atu for destroying those trees just to prove her strength. Mauder and Gia, on the other hand, were amazed by the power under Takuto's command and wanted to build a palace worthy of his majesty. Takuto thought it would be a waste of resources, but Mauder, Gia, and Enil all insisted, saying it would be inconceivable for their citizens to leave him without a castle. Atu told Takuto that, since they were taking it seriously, perhaps it would be best to grant their wish. Takuto admitted that a palace would be interesting, and since they had already dreamed of building a floating castle someday, he decided he could start planning for it now, since everything was going so well. But without his knowledge, the Paladins continued their slow advance toward the Dark Continent, and a confrontation would be inevitable once they discovered Managra. Meanwhile, in Managra, Takuto summoned all the citizens to a specific place, saying there was something they needed to witness. Everyone was confused when they saw him standing beside a pile of meat tree fruits. Then, Takuto raised his hand and began channeling mana into the fruits. Everyone watched, anxious to see what would happen, and to their astonishment, the pile of fruits transformed before their eyes into a scout insect. All were left speechless, for Takuto had essentially created a new form of life with a simple gesture. Edol announced that this was only a fraction of what Takuto was truly capable of, and that everyone should continue devoting themselves to him. Afterward, Takuto returned to the throne room, relieved that no one had asked too many questions about the creation of the scout insect, since he himself didn't fully understand how it worked. He and Atu had simply followed the in-game procedure to make it succeed, but seeing it in reality, it was hard to believe that simply injecting mana into a pile of fruit was enough to generate life. Now that they had confirmed they could safely create soldiers, Atu said they could move on to the next phase of the plan, creating a hero. This would take some time, as Takuto needed to accumulate enough mana to complete the ritual, but once it was done, they would become practically unstoppable. Excited, Atu asked which hero Takuto intended to summon first. He answered that it would be Ayla, the Insect Queen, because she provided the greatest vast advantages early in the game. Isla was capable of increasing the power of all nearby insectoid units, turning all scout insects into extremely effective combatants. In addition, Isla could produce soldier larvae to aid both in combat and in construction, making her perfect for accelerating Managra's development. Atu praised Takudo for such a solid strategy. Beyond her unique abilities, Isla was also the only heroine without a troublesome personality. The other heroes were a bit eccentric, one obsessed with conquering the world, and the other desiring to see the whole world burn. Takudo preferred not to deal with that for now, though he acknowledged that both were extremely powerful. Sooner or later, he would have to summon them, but he only hoped that when the time came, they wouldn't cause too much trouble, for his greatest wish was to live a peaceful life in this world. Meanwhile, back with the group of holy knights and mercenaries, they eventually come face to face with the furious hill giant, and dealing with such a creature will not be easy at all. Lornes orders all mercenaries to get ready for battle, but before any fight can even begin, Edel asks everyone to retreat and allow him to handle this matter by himself. Lornes attempts to protest, but Edel insists that it will be faster if he settles the problem alone. He also states that nobody has time to waste there. He walks toward the giant and begins to recite a prayer. Meanwhile, Lornes explains to the mercenaries that Edel is using a secret qualia technique, which allows him to imbue his strikes with divine power through prayers. The giant tries to strike Edel with its massive club, but Edel effortlessly slices it in half. The level of strength granted by divine arts differs from knight to knight, but in the case of a high-ranking holy knight such as Edel, his strength is comparable to that of a lesser dragon. Therefore, the giant has absolutely no chance and is defeated. Back in Managra, Takudo is calmly enjoying a hamburger. Yet Atu shows a certain concern, since he has been eating nothing but junk food ever since he arrived there. She does not intend to forbid him, but she suggests he should try to eat in a healthier way. Takudo, however, recalls that in his previous life, he had spent most of his time in the hospital, forced to eat nothing but tasteless, nutritious meals until the day he died. And now he wants to take this opportunity to finally enjoy food that is truly delicious. At that moment, he remembers something important and asks Atu to summon the guide for a meeting after the meal. Atu agrees, though she grows curious about the subject. Takudo explains that, thanks to the extra scout insect he managed to obtain, he can now explore more of the forest and wants advice on how to deal with what he found. Atu asks if he is talking about the village outside the forest, and he confirms. His main concern is that because the village is so close, sooner or later they will discover the existence of Managra. Fortunately, the village does not appear to belong to the Holy Kingdom of Kolha, which suggests that they are neutral and therefore it might be possible to negotiate with them. However, if outsiders ever came here, it certainly would not be just for a friendly conversation. Takudo tells Atu that there is no reason to worry, since there is no evidence that anyone is aware of their existence. Atu then jokingly warns him that such phrases never end well for the protagonist, and the two laugh together, until Takudo suddenly stops when he notices that people truly have arrived. And even worse, it seems to be a group of armed soldiers, which means they definitely did not come for peaceful talks. Takudo wants to avoid drawing unnecessary attention, so he asks Atu to go validate with them, trying first a peaceful approach, but making it clear that if that fails, she is free to unleash all the necessary violence. Outside the forest, the sacred expedition is preparing to march in. Before they advance, Wordle notices something strange beyond the tree line and orders everyone to step back. Moments later, Atu emerges from the woods wearing a cloak. Both Wordle and Lornes are surprised to see someone living there. They demand that she identify herself, and she answers politely, saying she is merely a humble elf who lives in those woods together with her people. Lornes, still filled with thoughts of slaughtering all elves, is about to provoke her, but Wordle interrupts him and changes the subject. He explains that he and his group are there only to investigate the forest and asks if she would be willing to let them enter. Atu politely refuses, saying that the Dark Elves prefer not to have their new home invaded without any reason at all. Lornes feels offended, considering it unacceptable that a mere elf would reject a request from the sacred men of God. But Wordle once again tells him to keep his mouth shut before he causes unnecessary problems. Although already suspicious, Wordle tries to persuade Atu Atu to allow their entry, telling her about the divine revelation received by Saint Selena, which mentioned a great calamity within this forest. Lornace panics, remembering that divine revelations are considered national secrets, and Wordle has just shared it with a complete stranger. He threatens to report him the moment they return to the kingdom, but Wordle replies that he may do whatever he pleases. Turning back to Atu, he asks once more if she is willing to permit the group to enter, but she still refuses. Atu claims that there is no need to search for anything inside the forest, because there is nothing dangerous or evil living there, and she begins to spin a blatant lie. Wordle decides that it is not worth arguing at that moment and orders everyone to return home. The truth is that Wordle is not a fool at all, he is a man of experience. He knows very well that Atu is extremely suspicious, practically a being dark to the very soul. He realized that she is a solitary person, yet bold enough to appear before an entire army, and the wisest course of action is clearly not to provoke her. The safest option is to retreat and plot another route before making any hasty decision. The problem, however, is that Lornace is far too obstinate to understand that what had just happened was, in truth, a tactical withdrawal. Unable to accept Wordle's decision, he accuses him of abandoning the mission and declares that he is stripping him of all authority. Immediately after, he orders the mercenaries to follow him, since they will enter the forest to investigate regardless of the consequences. Unfortunately, since it was Lornace who had hired the group, they are bound to obey him. Lornace goes even further. He commands his men to capture Atu immediately, accusing her of disobeying their orders. The mercenaries begin to close in, and despite Wordle's warnings, they are no longer willing to listen. Atu feels disappointed, for her attempt to resolve things peacefully has failed, despite her efforts to avoid bloodshed. But now there is nothing left that she can do. She acts swiftly, and in the very next moment, Lornace awakens collapsed on the ground, covered in blood, realizing that Atu has finally stopped holding back. He is somehow still alive, but the same cannot be said of the rest of his mercenaries, who lie annihilated. Wordle shouts for someone to send an urgent report to the kingdom, but the scout informs him that all messengers had already been eliminated by Atu. The few mercenaries that remain alive have no chance of crossing the forest in time, especially with her in attack mode. With no alternatives, he orders everyone to ready their weapons. For now, they must fight. Obeying the command, the mercenaries release a rain of arrows, but Atu blocks every single one effortlessly, coming out completely unscathed. This was exactly the type of situation Wordle wished to avoid when confronting someone like her, and Atu is just as disappointed as he is. She makes it clear that everything is Lornace's fault. If he had simply agreed to leave, she would have allowed them all to go without any problem. But instead, he chose to act like a paladin of justice, and now the price will be paid in lives. Finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake, Lornace asks Wordle if he knows exactly what Atu truly is. Wordle admits that he had suspected from the very beginning, which is why he wanted to avoid confrontation. But upon seeing her true form, he now has no doubts that Atu is a witch. In this world, a witch is regarded as a calamity-class creature, officially registered as a national threat. She is far too powerful for ordinary mercenaries to ever stand a chance. So Wordle orders everyone to retreat and leave only himself and Lornace to face her. Both of them charge at Atu, chanting prayers to infuse their strikes with sacred power. At first, Atu treats their prayers with disdain, blocking the blows with mockery and calling them weak. But to her surprise, they manage to slice off 2 of her mighty tentacle claws. She quickly realizes that attacks empowered with sacred magic cause additional damage against her. Wordle concludes that if they can sever all of her tentacles, Atu will be left defenseless. Of course, she has no intention of letting that happen, and by using 2 surviving mercenaries as human shields, she tries to force them to stop. But Wordle says that if they do not finish her right then and there, she could threaten the kingdom with her tentacles in the future, and for the sake of the nation, sacrifices must be made. Reluctantly, Lornace agrees. The 2 of them charge again and cut down not only the hostages, but also the remaining tentacles. Atu pretends to be surprised by how easily they sacrificed their own allies. For a moment, she even appears to be in real trouble, but all of it had been nothing more than a game to her. Seconds later, several new tentacles burst out from the ground, impaling Wordle repeatedly. In his dying breath, he tells Lornaise to run. Before being finished with a precise strike to the head, Lornaise stands in shock. He was certain they had cut off all of her tentacles, but Atu had never said she could not simply create more. In truth, she had been able to summon as many as she wished from the very beginning, and she was merely playing with them. Faced with the massacre, the mercenaries lose all will to fight. Since Atu does not seem interested in chasing them either, Lornaise shouts for everyone to flee in different directions, hoping that at least one of them will reach the kingdom alive to report what happened. They drop their weapons and run, but Atu remarks that she wishes they had done that from the start. Lornaise, however, remains behind to distract Atu. He strikes with his sacred sword, only to see her block it with the very same technique that both he and Wordle had been using. Confused, he cannot understand how an evil creature could possibly master sacred techniques. But then he discovers the truth. When she killed Wordle, Atu absorbed all of his experience and abilities, including his mastery of the sword. Now, using Wordle's techniques, she attacks him, praising the fallen knight as a true elite warrior and reminding him that he died only because Lornaise could not keep his mouth shut. Next, she mocks him, asking if he has already thought about his wife and daughter, something he had never once spoken aloud. It is then that he realizes she also absorbed Wordle's memories. With that, Lornaise understands that the more Atu kills, the stronger she will become. She even offers to share Wordle's final thought, which was the survival of his men, something noble, yet interrupted by Lornaise's selfishness. He tries to defend himself, claiming that the other mercenaries had escaped to report what had happened. But Atu corrects him, saying that they are all already dead. She explains that she had not bothered to chase them personally, but she never said she was alone. She had already ordered the elves to eliminate any survivors. As soon as the mercenaries fled, they were hunted down and slaughtered. Desperate at being the last one alive, Lornaise launches a frantic strike toward Atu's head, while she smiles, savoring every instant of his suffering. It does not take long before Atu has Lornaise completely subdued. Before killing him, she decides to rub salt into the wound, telling him everything that could have happened if he had only followed Wordle's plan from the beginning. According to Atu, they would all have returned home without a single scratch. Lornaise would have reunited with his wife and daughter, spending the rest of his life happily at their side, entirely ignorant of any calamity that might exist within the forest. But since he chose to act otherwise, now she will not only kill him, but will make certain to kill his entire family as well, so that he suffers. Atu remarks that she can read his mind to know what his family is like and discover their location effortlessly. She makes it clear that she is petty enough to carry out such an idea, and since she would already be going through the trouble, why not go even further? Perhaps killing all the people from every village that Lornaise passed through on his way to the forest might be interesting, and at the very moment each of them is enduring the most painful death imaginable, she will ensure they all know that everything is his fault. Desperate, Lornaise screams and begs her not to do such a thing. But Atu, already beginning to grow bored with the psychological torture, decides to end the matter and simply takes his life, silencing him once and for all. As soon as Lornaise falls dead, the guide appears to report that he and his men have successfully killed all the mercenaries who tried to flee, and that there will be no survivors to report the events of that day. Atu thanks him for the good work and also orders him to dispose of the corpses. Before leaving, the guide asks if she truly intends to follow through with the plan she had mentioned, killing Lornaise's family and every person he had ever spoken to. Atu replies that all of it was merely to terrify Lornaise and that she has no real intention of committing genocide. Besides, it would be far too much work, and she prefers to avoid unnecessary conflicts. Even so, she cannot afford to waste more time there. She must speak to Takuto immediately. Before the battle began, Atu had heard Wordle call her a witch. Although her official class is heroine, he had also mentioned a witch in the north, something Takuto had never seen in the original game. This leads Atu to conclude that the world they are in is different from the game's world. Takuto had already suspected this, even though many mechanics still function in a similar way. The best course is to assume that the fundamental rules are different. Fortunately, not all the changes are negative. Atu's ability to absorb techniques from defeated enemies has been improved. Now she can also retain part of those people's memories. Thanks to this, they obtained valuable information about the kingdom's current situation, taken directly from the minds of the members of the investigation squad. From what they know, the city of Qualia is currently occupied with a crisis in the north, which means they cannot focus on Minagra for the time being. Even so, The complete disappearance of the team they had sent will certainly raise suspicion, and that is inevitable. Sooner or later, the kingdom will take action to uncover what has happened. Takuto is aware of this, but for now their enemies possess no concrete information about Managra. Unless the leaders are utterly foolish, an immediate attack should not occur. At present, the greater concern is the disturbance in the north and the witch responsible for it. Atu tried to extract as much information as possible about witches from Wordle's memories, but he knew very little. Even so, there was one thing that was very clear. The Witch of the North was capable of causing destruction on a military scale all by herself. Meanwhile, in the Northern Territory, the witch Irakino had just destroyed yet another village, and she was already preparing to attack the next one. All the slain villagers were reanimated by her as undead, and Takuto does not know exactly what her abilities are. But considering the level of devastation she was able to unleash in such a short time, he begins to suspect that she too might have crossed over from another world, just like he and Atu did. If that is true, then the situation could become very complicated. Atu believes that since Irakino probably has an evil alignment, perhaps there might exist at least some chance of cooperation between them. She asks Takuto if they should try to approach her, but Takuto refuses the idea outright. They do not know her personality, and that would be an enormous risk. Atu laments the fact that all these problems are appearing precisely now, when things were finally starting to go well in Managra. But Takuto reminds her that Irakino is located at the far northern edge, far too distant to pose an immediate threat. Nevertheless, these new dangers make it clear that Managra must strengthen its defenses. Takuto decides that he will create another hero as soon as possible. Previously, he had planned to summon Ayla, but in light of these recent developments, he might need someone more oriented toward combat. In addition, he begins to reconsider his strategy of remaining in hiding. The existence of unpredictable forces such as a witch means that it is necessary to form an alliance with some nation. Qualia is out of the question after what Atu did to the Palagino. However, the country east of the forest is neutral and has not yet had direct contact with Managra. Therefore, once the palace is complete, Takuto intends to investigate that nation and evaluate the possibility of working together. Atu and Takuto finish their conversation, and she is already preparing to leave when she suddenly remembers something important that she must say before departing. She stops, takes a deep breath, and admits that there is one matter for which she wishes to apologize. Atu knows very well that Takuto dislikes unnecessary violence, especially when there exists the possibility of resolving matters peacefully. However, during the confrontation with the paladin, she admits that she allowed herself to get carried away by the situation and exaggerated things a little, perhaps much more than she should have. Takuto, however, does not react as she expected. He simply stands there staring at her with a neutral expression, without showing the slightest concern. After a brief silence, he asks in an almost disinterested tone why he should even care. At that instant, Atu is reminded of who Takuto truly is. And although in daily life he can appear to be a somewhat gentle individual, he is also the very embodiment of absolute evil, and therefore there are very few things that would ever truly bother him. It does not take long for the long-awaited construction of Takuto's palace to finally be completed, marking an important milestone for the growth and consolidation of his kingdom. Takuto becomes visibly excited, for he had always dreamed of having a gigantic palace that would symbolize his sovereignty. Atu, taking advantage of the moment, comments in a grandiose tone that one day that building will be so imposing that its highest point will touch the heavens themselves. Yet this conversation about the palace leads Atu to notice a curious detail. Despite the fact that Takuto is the king, he still does not have even a single attendant or personal servant to look after his needs. Takuto confesses that he had never really thought about it before, but he acknowledges that it would indeed be strange for a monarch not to have any created beings at his disposal. Because of this, Atu asks if he has any preference regarding the type of attendant he would like to have, so that she can provide someone suitable. Somewhat embarrassed, Takuto answers that he is fine with anyone, as long as it is someone easy to talk to. He admits with a shy smile that he is a terrible communicator. In truth, he has not even had a real conversation with any of the elves since he first appeared here. Atu, however, believes this is mainly due to the fact that Takuto appears as a living black mass of energy, with eyes of pure malice that terrify anyone who sees him. Even so, she assures him that he does not need to worry, because she already has a perfect plan to solve that issue. Takuto is not at all pleased with the exaggerated enthusiasm he sees on Atu's face, but he decides to let her go ahead with the idea, just to see what would happen. Atu summoned the guide, Mauter, and Emo, and ordered them to gather all the young girls from the village, claiming that Takudo desired them. Both Takudo and the guide were left speechless by such a statement, unable to believe what they had just heard. The guide, still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, asked Atu the exact reason for such an order. Speaking with the utmost calm, Atu explained that she had requested younger girls because she thought it would be easier for Takudo to practice and improve his conversational skills with them. But instead of clarifying it directly, she loudly declared that Takudo liked younger girls. That claim crossed every line, and before Atu could make the situation even worse, Takudo immediately cut her off, demanding that she explain everything properly, without leaving room for any misunderstanding. After hearing the full story, the old elf and the others sighed in relief, realizing that Takudo merely wanted a servant with whom he could converse more easily. The reason he had specifically asked for children was simple. Since the kingdom still lacked manpower, he did not want to take away valuable workers from their duties to make them into personal attendants. Children, who could not yet contribute to heavy labor, were the best choice. Mauder and the others were impressed by how practical and logical Takudo's reasoning was, and they agreed to bring children to meet him. Takudo even grew excited at the thought of finally having someone to talk to, but there was one detail he had not foreseen. To ordinary people, Takudo still appeared as a living calamity. The moment the children saw him, they began to cry desperately, unable to contain their fear. The atmosphere soured instantly, and Takudo felt terrible about what had happened. Trying to find a solution, Atu asked Mauder if he knew of any child who would not cry upon seeing the king. However, given the circumstances, Mauder could not think of anyone suitable. At that moment, the guide spoke up and asked if Takudo had ever met the twins. He explained that he had not introduced them earlier, because he believed they would not be proper attendants for a king. The two carried a troubled past, and he feared they might somehow unsettle Takudo. But with almost no options left, Atu ordered that they be summoned anyway. A few minutes later, the twins entered the palace. They formally introduced themselves to Takudo, revealing their names as 01 and 02. Right away, the contrast between the sisters was evident. 01 was more reserved, speaking respectfully, carefully choosing her words as though she were in the presence of a highly trusted monarch. 02, on the other hand, spoke naturally, even with a touch of familiarity, addressing Lord Takudo in a casual tone as if he were one of her companions. Atu, already experienced in judging people at first glance, immediately sensed that these children carried a past marked by suffering. Their eyes and postures revealed harsh stories far beyond what any child should have endured. Curious yet concerned, Atu asked the girl about the scars and wounds visible on her body. She explained that they were caused by a severe illness. Before she could elaborate further, Mauder stepped in to provide details. That illness had in fact been a deadly plague that struck their people some time ago. The girl had once been on the brink of death, but was fortunately cured. Still, the marks and scars left by the disease never disappeared, remaining on her body as a permanent reminder of that dark time. Atu then turned the conversation toward the girl's demeanor, asking what might have happened to her that made her act so differently and carry such an air of detachment. The girl hesitated briefly, but eventually revealed that her sister had gone through something extremely cruel and disturbing, something that had changed her forever. Before Atu could ask exactly what it was, the girl answered without hesitation, coldly declaring that she had eaten her own mother. The blunt and direct statement struck everyone with shock. This was far worse than anything Atu had imagined. Seeking to understand what it truly meant, she turned to Mauder for an explanation. With a face weighed down by sorrow and shame, he admitted that he did not take pride in what had happened, but at the time it had been the only possible solution. The tribe of elves had never forgotten the noble and desperate sacrifice the twins' mother had made to ensure that the others could survive. Hearing this, Takudo began recalling what he knew about the journey of the elves. He remembered that when the elves had been driven out of their homeland, they had to cross treacherous and dangerous regions for a long time. Under such extreme conditions, hunger became an enemy as deadly as any monster. In situations like these, painful sacrifices were sometimes unavoidable, and that episode had completely shattered Maria's perception of the world. In a way, perhaps it was even positive that she showed no fear of Takudo, since most people would feel intimidated by his presence. However, it was uncertain if that made her a good candidate to serve as the king's personal assistant. While Atu was reflecting on the situation, the other girl began walking toward Takudo. As she approached, she stared at him intently and commented, in her own way, that he looked white to her. Takudo, intrigued, was surprised, since everyone had always described him as the embodiment of darkness, but apparently this girl's perception was different. Driven by curiosity and by the feeling that there was something unique about her, Takuto asked directly if she would accept becoming his personal assistant, taking care of him in his daily life. Without hesitation, she answered that she would do her best. Thus, Takuto officially named her as his servant, and beyond that, as a candidate to become the future leader of Managra. Atu watched the scene in surprise. That had been by far the longest and most natural conversation Takuto had held with anyone besides herself. Still, she noticed that the other girl remained silent. Then, Takuto decided to ask her opinion. The girl replied firmly, saying that as the younger sister, she felt it was her duty to remain by Maria's side at all time. If Maria wished to serve the king, then she too would serve. Satisfied, Takuto declared that from that moment on, both would be responsible for taking care of him. The guide and Mauter exchanged light looks of concern over the decision. After everyone withdrew, Mauter quietly returned to speak with Takuto in private. He explained that since the death of their mother, the sisters had been unable to feel any genuine emotion. It was as if their hearts were completely closed off from the world, and serving him as attendants would inevitably bring many challenges. Even so, he asked Takuto to be patient and tolerant with them until, in time, they might begin to open up again. Later, the two officially began their duties. However, the first problems appeared almost immediately. While trying to bring Takuto a glass of water, one of the girls tripped over her own feet and spilled the entire contents on him. The other quickly offered to dry him and apologized for her sister's mistake, commenting that it was not the first time something like that had happened. Takuto, however, was not angry and saw no reason to scold them. Not long after, Atu entered the room and, seeing the scene, expressed clear disappointment with the girl, and before she could reprimand them more severely, Takuto intervened and asked her to go easy on them. But Atu remained visibly bothered by the number of mistakes both girls had made in such a short time of service. However, if Takuto did not wish to punish them, she could not take any action contrary to the king's decision. In the end, she sighed and chose to follow protocol, only warning them to behave properly, since the king had an important meeting to attend and, as his attendants, they would be present. Therefore, it was best for them to maintain proper posture and avoid any slips. The meeting began shortly afterward. The first to present her report was Emio, who currently led the construction department. She stood, greeted Takuto and Atu, and announced in an optimistic tone that with the palace finally completed, they currently had many workers available, as well as a large surplus of stored resources. This meant they could begin a new project immediately. Takuto and Atu exchanged a brief glance and agreed with the assessment, and after a few moments of discussion, they concluded that the next step should be the construction of a clinic. It would be essential to have a place capable of taking care of the health and safety of Managra's citizen. Emio was pleased and said she would start preparations without delay. Next, Atu asked to hear from the person responsible for resource collection. However, it turned out that this role was also under Emio's charge, which indicated the need to hire more staff to divide the responsibilities. Even so, Emio presented a positive overview. The gathering of food and materials was proceeding smoothly, and thanks to Takuto's skill, they were able to provide for various daily needs that would otherwise be impossible to produce on their own. Nevertheless, there was a price. Relying so much on emergency production consumed large amounts of the king's mana. Knowing this, Arau stated that they would need to find alternative methods of production as soon as possible. Takuto, in turn, said that for now they could continue relying on him, but that they should prioritize constructions and research that would increase their ability to generate mana. Atau thanked Emio for her dedication and moved on to the next topic, magical research. Molter stood up with a proud expression and reported that he had managed to create military magic. For the moment, only he was capable of using it. But he was confident that with training his subordinates would also master the technique. He added that it might even be possible to channel a powerful spell using the corrupted mana that the palace emitted. Still, since Takuto had made it clear that he did not want to start wars, it was likely that military magic would not be used frequently. For this reason, Atau and Takuto asked him to focus his efforts instead on research of the 6 great elements of the magical skill trees, since they would be far more useful for the peaceful development of the kingdom. Finally, Atau called the guide to give his report on the military forces. He informed them that at that moment the army counted only 5 reconnaissance insects. They were mainly occupied mapping the unknown areas of the cursed land, but the region outside the forest was mostly composed of wide open plains. which made exploration difficult without being seen. Since Minagra's priority was to remain hidden, this limited operations significantly. Atawu said that it was fine as it was, since they already had a detailed map of the entire forest. She ordered the guide to put all the insects on routine patrol in the surroundings, and the guide asked if it was really sensible to use all resources only for patrolling, expressing concern about that. However, Atawu answered confidently that she alone was more than enough to deal with any threat. Moreover, she and Takuto had already decided to create a new hero. Takuto then announced that after reflecting, he really would summon Ayla, and he also asked if all the necessary resources had been gathered, to which Mauter replied that both the wood and the provisions were ready. But the major obstacle continued to be the immense mana cost. After a long debate and reaching consensus from both sides, the meeting was finally brought to an end. The king was satisfied with the performance and dedication of everyone, and upon returning to his throne. However, he was surprised by one of the girls, who, distracted, bumped into him and dropped all the meeting documents onto the floor. The girls quickly apologized and began to gather the papers, but in the process some documents ended up being torn. After finishing, the two raised their eyes, already expecting a furious reaction, but Takuto simply told them not to apologize and went to sit down. At that moment, one of the girls approached and asked him if he was an evil person. Takuto said that his tendency was of evil alignment, and admitted that technically yes, he was evil. Then the girl wanted to know why he was evil if he still had not killed them. She said that the two of them kept making mistakes, and she knew very well that in other places servants were killed for far less. Intrigued, Takuto asked her, in her opinion, what was the difference between a good person and an evil person? And to the girl the answer seemed obvious. A good person was someone who always did good things, and an evil person was someone who only did bad things. Takuto smiled slightly and said that was only half of the truth. According to him, a good person really did need to follow just principles. Not lie, not steal, and not kill without reason. But there was something more that she had not yet considered. According to Takuto, an evil person is not necessarily someone who does bad things all the time. A person of his nature is essentially selfish, living by following only his own will, without caring about the feelings or consequences for others. Therefore, in his case, wanting to be kind to them did not contradict his nature at all. If he wanted to be patient with their mistakes, then he simply would be that way. In addition, Takuto made it clear that he had already noticed that they had been making mistakes on purpose since the beginning. He had realized that they wanted to provoke him to the point of anger. They expected that when he lost his patience, he would execute them, a fate that deep down they believed they deserved. The two girls did not deny it, and, with their eyes lowered and their voices heavy with pain, they confessed that recently they had indeed been trying to make him so angry that he would kill them. The reason was very simple. They believed they did not deserve to continue living after what had happened in the past. The weight of their mother's memory, and of how they had survived, had corroded the sense of worth they once had of themselves. Takuto pretended not to understand something that he himself had never experienced. He admits that he cannot completely put himself in their place, but he still understands how difficult, almost impossible, it would be for them to forgive themselves. However, he also states with conviction that he believes their mother did not sacrifice herself so that they would be consumed by guilt. She did it because she wanted her daughters to survive and someday find some kind of happiness. He tells the girls that they are free and that the best thing they can do with their lives now is to live to the fullest. That way, their mother's sacrifice will not have been in vain. He says that it will be difficult to move forward, but he promises to be by their side for every step of this journey. His words strike the two directly in the heart. They can no longer hold back their tears, and in a sudden impulse they embrace Takuto tightly, remaining there crying until exhaustion finally overtakes them. Later, Atu enters the throne room and finds the following scene: the two twins, asleep and leaning against the king's throne, while Takuto calmly allows them to rest there. For an instant, Adu feels a pang of jealousy upon seeing them so close to him, but she quickly remembers that there is something urgent to discuss. She clears her throat and announces that the report on the nearby city has been completed. The city is called Dragontum, a member of the multiracial and neutral nation known as Fortone, because it shelters several different races living together. Takuto considers that negotiations there could be relatively easy. However, something immediately draws his attention. Dragontum was located in an extremely remote place, and Atu explains the reason. The city had been built there because of a dragon vein mine, which are exceedingly rare deposits capable of producing mana naturally, a resource of immeasurable value to any nation. For that reason, Atu Takuto suggests that they should seriously consider securing control of this resource as soon as possible. The report also brought worrying information. Dragonton was currently under attack by barbarians, including ogres and goblins, and was struggling to defend itself. Takuto asks if the city had already received reinforcements from its homeland, and Atu responds that as far as she was able to investigate, there was no sign of any reinforcements on the way. The situation, therefore, was deteriorating day by day. Seeing this as an opportunity, Takuto deduces that there were probably already refugees fleeing the region. If Minagra were to offer shelter to these people, they would be killing two birds with one stone, increasing their population while at the same time establishing ties of goodwill with Dragonton. Over time, this relationship could open the way to claiming the Dragon Vein mine as their own possession. He leans back on the throne, thoughtful, yet with a faint smile on his face, because the scenario that is unfolding appears more and more promising. The anime is still ongoing, so if you want to see its part 2, subscribe here to the channel and stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Bye, see you later.